Frank wears Wally.
Thanks. Mr. Redmond stripes. Thanks very much for inviting me along to talk about Diabetic Foot Australia. So Ian and Michelle have been very kind in letting me have a few of your minutes to talk through the problem of diabetic foot in Australia, some of the solutions and how to be involved in those. So I'll only keep you for about 30 minutes, 4 hours. But a lot of the solutions, before I get to the problem, are really revolve around Keith's 7 Ps, and I'll get to them in a second. The problem in terms of diabetic foot in Australia, I don't know if you've seen two probably pertinent events in the last couple of months. Firstly, there was Diabetes Week about a month ago. And in Diabetes Week, they released some research that said that diabetes will be the #1 cause of burden disease in Australia in 5 years. Secondly, we had the Leaders Communique, which was all the premiers and the Prime Minister get together, which might have been overshadowed by a particular helicopter trip that was there. That was a gag. My wife always says don't use humour until you get to know people, so that was already there.
Listen to your wife, mate.
Yeah, sure. So the Leaders Forum spelt out in their first communique, they said health is the top priority in Australia government. The next thing they said is to deal with health in Australia, we need to expand primary health care to reduce hospitalisation, because that's where the costs are. Then they went on to say that diabetes, cardiovascular disease and mental health are those priorities. So diabetes is a big deal, but where does feet fit into diabetes? Well, feet, as you may or may not know, is a big deal in my life, but it's a big deal. So feet cause the second highest burden of disease of the big 4 diabetes complications. So it's cardiovascular disease, eyes, kidneys, feet. And in fact, if you split up cardiovascular disease into stroke and heart disease, feet nearly get there in terms of numbers and costs. So feet are, I guess, a silent epidemic, for want of a better word, because of probably the neuropathy in terms of the burden of disease in Australia. I often say, if you try and look at or quantify the burden of disease for feet in diabetic feet in Australia, there's about 1.7 million Australians with diabetes, and they forecast that to be 3 million in 2030. And at that same time, they are suggesting that at that particular time, every adult, well, it's 1 in every 3 adults develop diabetes in their lifetime. So where was I going with that? So essentially 300,000 people have loss of feeling or peripheral neuropathy or peripheral arterial disease, which is poor circulation, from diabetes in their feet today. If you put them together, that forms the city of Canberra. Of all the people in hospital tonight with a diabetic foot ulcer problem, if you put them all together, it's about 500 or 600 of them, that would fill the hospital of Canberra Hospital. And just to use the Canberra analogy again, if we looked at everyone who had an amputation today because of diabetes, it makes up the Canberra Raiders rugby league side. So 12 or 13 people today had an amputation due to diabetes. So what I often say is perhaps the problem is as big as Canberra, or perhaps Canberra is the problem. It always gets a laugh at that. So where does Australia fit in terms of diabetic foot? Are we doing badly? Are we doing well, etc.? Well, there's a number of reports that suggest that perhaps we aren't doing as well as we could do. OECD report suggests from a few years ago that Australia was the second worst country in the developed world for diabetes amputation rates, and that's really a marker of how we're doing in diabetic foot disease. We're starting to get a little bit better. And why are we starting to get a little bit better? Well, we've had a lot of networks or partnerships start to form in states across Australia, particularly state health departments, so between multidisciplinary teams. And what we've seen in the last year in particular in WA and in my home state of Queensland is there's been a significant reduction in diabetes amputations and hospitalisations, because essentially getting interested people together, multidisciplinary people, surgeons, medicos, nurses, allied health, together to work on this problem, both clinically and research and policy. And what we want to do with Diabetic Foot Australia, when I get to the solutions, and thanks to Ian and the funding and John, is we want to bring those state networks together into a national network to form a national diabetic foot clinical network. And what we've termed that is Diabetic Foot Australia. And this is where a lot of Keith's 7 Ps come into it. Please excuse me for using some of the 7 Ps, Keith, but there's another P for you. What we're looking to do is we've got a goal of ending avoidable amputations in a generation, which might sound like a pipe dream. But if we look 25 years back, there was no research in diabetes at all. And in fact, when there was a study done with amputations, diabetes wasn't actually mentioned 25 years ago. So we've come a long way in that space. So 25 years forward is not unforeseeable. And to do that though, we need the Australian diabetic foot community to work together. And that's patients, that's clinicians, that's researchers, and that's particularly industry as well. And what we're wanting to do is we want to optimise the access of patients to evidence-based practice, the best care they can get via clinical services. And so we want to encourage and facilitate that across Australia in terms of implementing that care. Secondly, we want to develop research, some innovative, near-term, industry-led potentially research in diabetic foot disease that will bring us to the goal of ending avoidable amputations in a generation. And so what we're setting up is a number of outputs to try and deliver those two objectives that leads to our goals. So we're trying to set up an online communities with social media to try and get clinicians, researchers, patients, industry to talk to one another about this problem. We're trying to get a database, a diabetic foot database that will work under Michelle's Australian Wounds Registry to try and form a dashboard to monitor how we're going in terms of across Australia in terms of diabetic foot disease, and also monitor amputation rates as well. We're also importantly trying to set up a clinical trial, a truly national clinical trials network. And under Diabetic Foot Australia, we've got representatives on the steering committee from every state, and we've got across every discipline. We've got vascular, we've got, I can't remember them, podiatry, nursing, and we've got medicos with endocrinology, etc. And we're trying to work on infectious diseases as well. And what we want to do with these particular outputs is we want to bring the community together in an integrated fashion using Keith's P's, passion, profile, patience, and a few other P's, sorry Keith, to deliver our goal at the end of the day, which is ending avoidable amputations in a generation. And to do that, we need all of us to work together. So patients, clinicians, industry and research, as I said before. To be involved in Diabetes Foot Australia, you can easily register for updates as we progress building these foundations over the next year to build this Australian diabetic foot community that hopefully will make us one of the best nations in the world when it comes to diabetic foot disease in the next 5 to 10 years and bring us to our ultimate goal of ending avoidable amputations in a generation.